Welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. Bill Stepien here. I'm joined, as always, by my friend Justin Clark. How are you, Justin?
Bill, I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing just great. Thanks to our listeners for joining us. This is, as we know, the place where we talk about what you need to know about what's going on in the crazy world of politics. As always, obligatory reminder to like, subscribe, comment, share, do all those things with this podcast and your friends. Crazy time in politics. A lot going on in Washington just in the last 7, 10, 14 days. We usually talk presidential politics each week, but what's going on down in D.C. in the halls of Congress, it's driving the news these days. So, Justin, in case someone's been asleep for the last couple of weeks, briefly bring everyone up to speed on what they missed.
Well, yeah, crazy times in D.C. Last week, the House of Representatives, on the eve of a government shutdown, passed a continuing resolution with a lot of Democrat votes, and which was quickly followed by a motion to vacate the speakership that was filed by Congressman Matt Gaetz. He and 7 other Republicans were joined by every Democrat to actually vacate the chair of the Speaker of the House. I don't think anyone saw what came next coming. I think everyone anticipated Kevin McCarthy to make another run at it, but he quickly announced after the vote that he would not be seeking the speakership again, and opened up the Republican caucus to a new speaker vote midterm, which is unusual. It doesn't happen a ton. So really interesting times.
So I think we want to spend a little time today, Justin, diving in on what's going on right now. And I'm not talking about broad messaging or 10,000-foot topics. I think I'd like to bring our listeners into the halls of Congress to shed a light on the nitty-gritty tactical side of what's happening. What conversations are happening, who's having the conversation, how this all works, who's doing what's being said over beers or over a steak, what deals are being made, what alliances are being created. In short, what's happening now. And Justin, when you and I were talking about the best way to talk about this stuff, one person came to my mind who could help our listeners. And this someone is a DC insider only in the best sense of the word. Someone who's had a front seat to history for a long time in DC and saw not only how Washington worked for the time he was in DC in Congress, but he also influenced the way DC worked. And that's my good friend, your good friend, Justin, former Virginia Congressman Tom Davis. Tom won election to the House in 1994. Tom, if I'm wrong on any facts, chime in, and I know you will. Won election to the House in 94, the famous year of the contract with America, the historic year that Republicans took control of the House for the first time in, I think it was about 40 years. Tom represented Northern Virginia, was reelected in 96, 98, 2000, 02, 04, and 06. Chairman of the NRCC, the National Republican Congressional Committee, in 98 and 02. And we talked a lot about this in the White House, Justin. In 2002, under Tom's watch, Republicans gained 8 seats in Congress in the second Bush midterm, or the first Bush midterm, rather. Only the third time since the Civil War. This is a fact we talked a lot about, Justin, that the president's party gained seats in a midterm election. Usually a president's party loses seats in a midterm. So Tom is a pure political junkie. When I was in the White House, Justin, when you were in the White House, we'd have a lot of conversations with the congressman about not just the congressional map. He would dive down and talk about voting districts within the congressional map. He knows the nuts and bolts that well. So, Tom, thank you for spending a couple minutes with us today.
Well, Bill, thanks for having me. And let me say it was 2000 and 2002 that I was campaign chairman. I won the chairmanship in 2000 because in 1998, the party had underperformed. The caucus was getting ready to throw out Gingrich because he had he and his leadership team hadn't missed. They had not handled the expectations of the caucus very well. They kept saying we'd pick up 15 to 20 seats, and we lost a bunch of seats. And so I was able to win a caucus vote there. And it leads me to the one thing your readers come away with anything else is the fact that in a caucus vote, it's a secret ballot. And, members are getting called, will you support me? And they invariably say yes, because it's a secret ballot and there's really no accountability for it. And it taught me a lesson that the only member you can believe is the member who looks in the eye and says, I'm voting against you.
Well, you're a smart man for taking the 1998 midterms off of your ledger. Pardon me for putting them on, and thank you for correcting me. So take us back to 1994, 1995. You run for your seat in Northern Virginia. You win your seat in Congress the year of the famous contract with America. You knock off a Democrat incumbent, by the way, and you enter Congress with an insanely, I look back at your freshman class, an insanely diverse group of freshmen. People like Lindsey Graham, Joe Scarborough, David McIntosh, Sonny Bono, Sam Brownback, J.C. Watts, just a very eclectic group of people. And, I think we saw Speaker McCarthy have a hard time managing a fractured, divided, unruly caucus. But your freshman class seemed to be, in 1994, headed into 95, seemed to be, how did Gingrich hold it together, if he held it together? What lessons can the new speaker learn from what Gingrich did in your freshman class?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is, as you noted, this was the first time Republicans had held the House in 40 years. Republicans didn't even know where the keys to the men's room were. I mean, they found all these secret hideaways they didn't know existed. Once you get control, they found parking places that the Democrats had given to their lobbyist friends. They were kind of reinventing the wheel. Plus, you had 70 plus new members coming in, most of whom had no political experience at all. How do you handle that? The one thing Gingrich had going for us is he had just about all of us sign something called the Contract with America. And so for the first 3 months, we kind of had our to-do list, and it held us together against the Democrats as we checked off one box after another, upholding this contract with America that we had all signed on to. So for the organizing time, instead of organizing against each other and splitting up into factions, we had a unifying force with this contract that kept everything together. The irony is that if you asked a member what was in the contract with America, and this is what a lot of the press did, members couldn't tell you what was in the contract with America. So Newt made up these tags with the contract with America in kind of a shorthand, and we wore it around with a lariat around our necks, carrying it around everywhere we went. But that was what held us together for the first 3 months to keep us organized, to really stop a kind of chaos that might have ensued otherwise.
Interesting. Were there who else was on his leadership team? I assume that there was a leadership team that he used to help coalesce support, keep personalities in line. What was that like?
Well, so really the guy who put it, Dick Armey, of course, was the majority leader. Dick was, he was a PhD in economics. It was more intellectual. And then you had Tom DeLay. And Tom was a roll up his sleeves, get it done kind of guy. And DeLay, as the whip, really put together a good whip operation, recognizing that all factions of the party needed to be represented. And that's how he kept his eyes and ears on what everybody was doing. If somebody was having trouble at home or was having trouble with their office standing it up, the whip organization would go in and try to help them and move things together. It was really Tom DeLay kind of was the glue that kind of held that thing together under Newt. It was interesting because they didn't all really get along that well, but they saw that working together, they could accomplish their goals.
Let me ask another question. What lessons do you think the new speaker could learn from what you saw under Speaker Gingrich? Anything that whoever the new speaker is could think back and see? What would Newt, if Newt were to write a memo, we know Newt likes writing memos. If Newt were to write a memo to say, this is how you should do it, what were some things that you saw him do that you think could translate to to today's party?
Well, let me start by saying Newt Gingrich was sui generis. Nick, he had led us. He was the Moses. He had led us to the promised land after 40 years out in the wilderness. So Newt, to that extent, had a sort of a patina around him that somebody new coming in doesn't need. Newt had gotten us there. With a new speaker, they're there on their own, and now they're electing a speaker. It's a completely different dynamic where the speaker is kind of the creation of the caucus, whereas before the caucus was the creation of the speaker. He'd been all around the country campaigning for people, raising money for people, recruiting people to run. And there was kind of an IOU out there to Newt Gingrich for leading us into the promised land after 40 years in the wilderness. You don't have that now. You almost have the opposite effect. The other thing we didn't have is we didn't have the media that we have today that's so split up. I mean, in those days you had talk radio, but you didn't have cable news to the extent you have it now. You certainly didn't have an internet. So message control was something that Newt could handle by going out and getting talk radio on board very easily. And there were just a very few organs you needed to communicate with to get with members. Nowadays, it's such diverse platforms. Nobody controls what's said or done. Everybody's kind of a free agent, and it's just become more unruly. So you're dealing really with a different planet than what Newt had in 1994. Things have changed with that rapidity.
And every fool can have a podcast, I guess. So,
yeah,
yeah, and I guess C-SPAN started to ruin it all.
What are the lessons? Yeah, what are the lessons learned? I think McCarthy right away had all the competing factions would have representatives of the different families, and they would get together and try to work that out. But even then, the Freedom Caucus couldn't enforce what their leaders agreed to on the CR to some of their members down below. You just have so many free agents that are out there raising money online, saying some of the craziest things you can say. There's just a certain attraction with elements of the electorate to that. So it's just a different world today. I think McCarthy did what he could. He was pretty smart. He was a very good inside operator. But the caucus became so diverse, and his own baggage just increased over time as you tell people one thing and it doesn't happen, that I think the trust factor eroded him with a number of members, and it just caught up to him.
So 94, 95, we've talked about. Fast forward to November of 98. There was a lot going on, a lot that led into this, but in the weeks and months that followed November of 98, Newt resigns first from the speakership, then he resigns from Congress. And I think most, stop me when I'm wrong, I think most expected Congressman Livingston to assume the speakership from Gingrich. Yet in the same day that Livingston said he would not seek the speakership, Denny Hastert stepped in and all but had it wrapped up on the same afternoon. What did Hastert do to step in and go ahead?
Yeah, it was almost that quick. I mean, most of us were shocked on the floor that morning. We're debating impeachment, and Livingston gets on and discloses that he had indeed had an affair or an encounter, and just said for that reason he was going to step down and not seek the speakership, which the caucus had already elected him to do, and he expected Bill Clinton to do the same thing. It sent the caucus into shock. I mean, people were heading to the phones, and I was back in the cloakroom with Tom DeLay, who was the whip. Now, Denny Hastert was the chief deputy whip. He was kind of he was the right hand of Tom DeLay, but everybody liked and trusted Hastert. And Chris Cox immediately jumps into the race for speaker. But DeLay is saying, look, he said, it's got to be Denny Hastert. And so he walks over to Hastert and says, will you consider it? And Denny goes into a phone booth and calls his wife. And he's in there for about 15 minutes. And everybody's kind of glued to the phone booth. And he comes out, he says, yeah, I'll do it. And it wasn't over at that point because Cox was still in the race. But DeLay with his whip team had, basically such penetration and respect of the different members that it was over. And it was, DeLay knew he couldn't be the speaker. He was a little too radioactive, but he put his chief lieutenant in. And as I said, Denny he was a coach. He had a nicer guy persona. The irony is that we thought Denny Hastert is the one guy nobody would ever suspect of having the kind of problems that Gingrich and Livingston were having with any kind of affairs outside of marriage and that he had no skeletons in his closet. And I think that was the reason he was picked at the time. Yeah. Little did we know.
Yeah. Did Hastert have any clue before Livingston raised his hand on the floor to make his announcement?
I don't know who Livingston told about it. I know that I was part of the elected leadership at that point. One of a handful of us that were elected into a leadership spot. I had won my seat in the leadership just a month before as the campaign chairman, and I had no clue. So I suspect maybe DeLay knew, but I don't think Hastert had any clue at all that was going on. And the members, the rank and file members, didn't have to. And you just kind of pulled the pin out of the hand grenade and threw it on there, and it could have gone a lot of different directions. But Tom DeLay had the best organization in the House in the whip. He was a whip's whip, if you know what I mean. He was the model of what a whip should be in terms of being able to deliver. He had everybody's home phone numbers. He had their cell phone numbers. He knew how to reach people. And he had a good organization that was across all different ideological lines in the caucus. So once that whip organization really was unleashed, it became difficult for anybody to try to fight it. Cox was outside of that organization and didn't know what hit him.
So with the experience of 94 and 95 in mind, with what we just talked about with Hastert going from 0 to 60 and wrapping it up before most knew what had happened, take us inside the Capitol right now. What's happening right now with Scalise and Jordan or anyone else who's interested, McCarthy again, perhaps, or what should be happening right now? What sort of outreach is happening? Is it member to member? Is it staff to staff? Are people having coffee? Are people going out for steak dinner? What's the messaging? Is there a whip operation? What's staff? The whole thing, just on a really nuts and bolts level, which you're so good at. What's happening right now?
Well, I think both of these, both Scalise and Jordan have their own organizations within the organization, if you know what I mean. And I think they were both started very quickly. I don't know what kind of contingency planning was done, but Scalise, having been the whip and now being the leader, has a wide berth of acquaintance with a lot of members, and put his leadership team, if you will, in right away, getting on the phone to people and then getting Scalise on the phone to people. I think the same with Jordan. Jordan has, as a base, he has the more conservative elements of the House with him, by and large. And he also has his perch on the Judiciary Committee, where he is the chairman, and that's just in the Ohio delegation. So all of this kind of kicks in at this point in terms of a base. And after that, they are out calling people and telling these candidates, this is who you have to call. And the phones have just been burning up over the last several days.
Let me ask you this, Congressman.
Look, yeah, go ahead.
A lot of people have talked about the margins in the House, and it's obviously a five vote margin. What kind of margins were you dealing with back in 97 when this was all going down? How much of a difference? What's the magic number in terms of cushion you need if you're trying to make one of these votes work?
That's a good question, because you have a lot more people say they're with you than not. This is more complicated by the fact that even if you have the votes within the conference, and I dare say if this went back to the conference and Kevin McCarthy stood, he'd carry 90% of the conference. He got 96% on the floor. The problem with a margin so slim is you have a handful of members think that their opinion is more important than the opinion of the conference, and they can take that choice down. And that makes this more complicated, is that you might be able to win the conference vote, but you might have some holdouts. More important than that, one group who's felt aggrieved before and thought one group was really punching above their weight and exercising their authority to overturn the conference choice might decide now they want to exercise their veto. So you not only have to win the conference, which is important, but you've got to be able to hold everybody on the floor at a time when you have more independent agents than ever. And look, the biggest difference today from 20 years ago is we recognized where our majorities came from. When I was campaign chairman in 2002, our majorities were 5 and 6 votes, just like now. But we held together as a conference, and we focused our votes on the floor to protect our vulnerable members from these swing districts, from difficult votes and putting them into situations to not allow them to vote for things that the Senate was never going to agree to and get them on the record. We worked to protect those members because those are the members that made us the majority, that gave us our gavels and allowed us to set the agenda. Today, those members are marginalized by the caucus, and it's these members from these safe seats, these plus 20, plus 30 Republican districts who are worried about their primaries that end up forcing all of these votes on everybody else. And at some point, members from more marginal districts, from the Northeast in particular, are going to say, you know what, he may be your choice for Speaker, but I'm not going to vote for him on the floor. I'm going to show my independence from you guys because the brand name of the party is killing me. I'm fine. People in my district will vote for me for the name on the back of the jersey, but unfortunately, in election day, they're voting for the color of the jersey, and you are the color of the jersey with you guys in charge is a bad color right now, and people aren't voting for us. So what's happened over the last 25 years is we have devolved into what I call parliamentary politics, where voters are now voting for the party, not the person. And when members come to Washington, they're voting with the party. If you break with the party on an issue, you don't get rewarded. You get punished. We saw that with McCarthy. He ends up making a compromise, and members of the party get upset with him. We saw this with Peter Meyer in Michigan, who votes for impeachment, and the Democrats end up spending several $100,000 against him in a Republican primary in an independent expenditure to take him down because he can win re-election, but a weaker Republican can't. And the Democrats didn't have McCarthy's back when he kept the government open. They end up punishing him. So the rewards and punishments are very perverse at this point because the party's leaderships are holding together. It was explained to me this way, that the duty of the minority is no longer being a minority shareholder in government, it's to get to be the majority. And so they become the opposition party on everything. And it's complicated everything. We always had Democrats who we could pull in on votes. Our whip team would go to the Blue Dog Democrats or something if we needed votes on the other side. We had open communications with them. And we would take care of them in terms of making some of their amendments in order and those kind of things to keep them on board. I will never forget a couple of members who we cut deals with, that they would vote for us if we needed for the speakership, and then we wouldn't go hard against them in a general election. That doesn't exist anymore.
It was 8 members, right? Who ousted McCarthy?
8,
Were there
yes.
any of the 8 that surprised you, Congressman, either based on their ideology or geography or anything? Any surprises among the 8?
Well, I mean, Nancy Mace makes no sense at all to me because her district is, I think, may get redrawn at this point, and to a much heavier African-American relationship and this kind of thing. And her record's pretty eclectic to begin with. I'm just saying I don't understand that at all. The other folks, Boebert has taken a very safe district and made it very, very marginal, and she continues to act that way. Matt Gaetz is who he is. Bob Good that's kind of always been his brand, so it didn't surprise me. His district is just Republican enough. He probably doesn't get punished for that in a general. And the irony is, if you ask members who's calling their offices, the calls were overwhelming to get rid of McCarthy, not to keep McCarthy. The activist base, if you will, the angry group out there is just very anti-Washington, anti-establishment, and anti-whoever is in there. And it happened to be McCarthy at this point. The substance doesn't matter as much as the way the media carries this, and everybody's got their own information sources. We used to say people tune into the news for information. Now we say they tune in for affirmation, and they find a news source they're comfortable with. It's going to, if you will, validate their worldviews. And so you end up with basically a very eclectic group, even within your conference, that view the world very differently, and holding them together is tough.
we all saw President Trump weigh in support of Congressman Jordan. Does that matter in your eyes, Congressman? Is this an insider's process? And is there a feeling among those on the inside? They just kind of brush that off like a gnat at a summer picnic. Does that matter? What's your sense of the president's endorsement in this process?
Well, if this were an open recorded vote, I think it would, no question, it would help Jordan, because people don't want to get crosswise. Maybe they don't mind getting crosswise with Trump, but they don't want to get crosswise with Trump's voters, who are a dominant force in the Republican Party. But it's a secret ballot. And so I think it has an effect with some members to bring them over. But I think in others, they're going to run in districts that Donald Trump may not be doing that well. And they don't need to be associated with Donald Trump when they go back to their district. They're going to try to make themselves as independent as they can. So I think it remains to be seen if this is a plus or a minus. I think obviously Jordan felt he needed it. So I think we'll have to see how that plays off. I think all things considered, if you asked me if I was going into a conference vote, would I rather have him than not? I'd rather have him. It also, I think, points to probably no defections on the right in terms of if you win the conference, can I hold it on the floor? I think the question then is, can you hold moderates? Or there's some of them that might want to break off if you win the conference vote, just if nothing else, then to show the hard right members who took down McCarthy, we're not letting you call the shots. And that just has to play out at this point. And I think it's a complicated equation and nobody knows how this is going to play out.
The profile of Jordan to this point in Congress has been very different than the profile of Scalise. Does any profile have more of an advantage in this process? Scalise's relationships, Jordan's relationship with the base. Does one of them put them ahead of the other in terms of which matters more in this process?
Well, every member is going to make their own determination. A lot of this is going to be determined. Am I better off if Jordan is Speaker? Am I going to be able to, win a steering committee spot for the committee I want to be in? Am I more likely to be a subcommittee chairman or committee chairman if Jordan is there, or if Scalise is there? Who's going to take care of me? That's always, I think, number one concern. Scalise has a lot of sympathy with Republican base because he was shot at, as you know, and wounded and very serious injury at the congressional baseball practice. And he carries around, but he also has health issues, which in some ways may generate sympathy, and others members may say, is he going to be strong enough to work through this thing? And so I think the members balance all of that. Jordan came on as a firebrand when he came to Congress when I first knew him, but a lot of members I'm hearing that you would think would be hesitant to vote for Jordan are calling it Jim Jordan 2.0. They like the fact that he's a fighter, that he's smart, and he has forged some strong relationships. He's got McCarthy supporting him. That would surprise people if you try to break this thing along ideological lines. I think when you talk about a swing district, say in New York, California, Ohio, that people feel, well, Scalise doesn't have the same baggage Jordan has with the more moderate and liberal press, and may not harm me as much. But I'm not sure that's enough that they would buck him on the floor. We'll just have to wait and see. But those are the factors that go into this. Both of these members have very conservative voting records. I saw one group that said Scalise actually had a more conservative record, but Jordan has been more out front on those kind of issues. He hasn't been in leadership, so he hasn't had to make the compromises leadership has to make on that. And people see him as the unadulterated conservative in this race. But every member is making their own calibration on this, and they're getting their own validation from other members. So what I had and what these members have is they're calling members, and then they're having their steering committee call these members to validate, are you sure we can rely on this person's support? And how do we influence them to come over? And you've got to win the conference vote first. And then secondly, you've got to be able to hold 200 and I guess it's 217 on the floor right now as well. And that's really the equation. And nobody knows how this works up because the feelings within the conference are pretty raw.
You mentioned promises of committee seats or assignments, how much does that play into this process? Do you have any famous memories of holdouts who were brought over with some of those promises? How do those conversations happen? Are they had member to member? Just walk us into that world.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, I think one of the things that got McCarthy in trouble and has gotten other members in trouble, and I'll give you another example on the Democratic side, is people support you and they expect, many times they extract something in return. Can I get this? I want to go on the Ways and Means Committee or the Appropriations Committee, or I'm in line to be, or I'm going to try out to be chairman of this committee when this vacancy comes up. And is this person going to help me or hurt me? The speaker putting their finger on the scale can make a difference whether you get a committee chairmanship or not, and certainly whether you get on a committee or not. I'm reminded of the story of a Democratic leader who had promised a Ways and Means Committee seat to about 3 or 4 different Democrats so that they would run again because they were the only Democrats that could hold their districts, and he wanted to keep them in the House, and they'd promised it to him. But unfortunately for him, a vacancy came up in the middle of the congressional session, not at the beginning of a new Congress where you might have some vacancies to where you could plug these people in. And he had promised the next seat to 3 or 4 people, and he gave it to Earl Pomeroy. And one of the members who had been promised the seat said, well, you promised that seat to me. And the Democratic leader said, well, I gave it to Earl in writing. And he said, oh, so a promise is only good for you in writing? Now, from the leader's point of view, he thought he'd have several seats to deal with, given retirements and ratios, to take care of everybody when he promised him the seat. But when it came up, he could only give it to one, and he lost credibility. Multiply that with the kind of things Kevin has to go through, and you see people get disappointed along the way. And they may hear one thing and they mean something else, and there's going to be a lot of jockeying for assurances. I have another member that went to McCarthy and was on a committee chairmanship. McCarthy said, stay out of it. And McCarthy didn't stay out. He lobbied hard and knocked this guy out of a chairmanship. This person stayed with McCarthy on the floor because it was politically expedient for him to do that. But Kevin had those kind of problems within the caucus, which leaders often have. Gingrich had some of the same problems.
Well, look, Justin, this has been great. This has shed a lot of light on the craziness that's happening every moment, every minute down in D.C. To our listeners, thank you for joining us this week. A special thanks to our very special guest and our good friend, Tom Davis. Tom, thank you for joining us. As always, our listeners, make sure to like, subscribe, comments, and share the podcast. And we will talk to everyone next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.